Hi Dragonflies, welcome back to Dragonfly Spirit Studio. I'm Lynn Bauer. This video is part of my online watercolor workshop in painting skies and clouds. If something in this video is puzzling to you because you've missed some of the earlier videos, you can find all of the previous videos and projects on my website. Go to dragonflyspiritstudio.com and click on the links for Learn and then Watercolor Skies and Clouds. All the videos are there in order, so you don't have to search around for where are they on YouTube. And there are handouts and reference photos and templates and cheat sheets, all sorts of other materials, and you can find it all there in the same place. So far in the Project 2 lessons, we've learned how to handle skies where the clouds are darker than the sky by laying down a base wash and then dropping the clouds in wet into wet. Or skies like this by lifting from a wet wash or a dry wash. Lifting can be a very convenient and quick technique to use when you only have a few clouds like this and you're really just using the clouds as set dressing and not as one of the main components of the painting. But what if you have a scene more like this? Or like this? That's a lot of lifting. For a scene like this, it's actually easier to paint the clouds by painting what isn't the clouds. In other words, by negative painting. So I'm going to paint the blue areas and leave the cloud areas the white of the paper. And then if I have clouds with a lot of shadowing, I can come back and add the shadows later. We're going to start with this scene, which doesn't have a lot of shadowing, so that we can get the idea first. And in fact, you may remember from the Project 1 videos that one tip when you're learning techniques is if the sky is very complex, like this sky is, then you would need a larger painting to really capture all of what's going on in this sky. So we're not going to try to capture this whole sky. We're going to zoom in on just this one section and learn the technique of negative painting here. Then to do the whole sky, we'd just be doing the same thing, but more of it. In keeping with our motto of one difficulty at a time, I'm not going to talk much about color in this video. I'm going to focus on the technique of negative painting, and I'll just use up some of the wash that's left over from our video on lifting. I'm working on saturated paper as we discussed in the first lesson video for Project 2. And I'm going to begin, as we often do, by wetting the page to make sure I have a uniform film of water so everything will behave the same over the whole surface. Now at this point, the paper is quite wet, and so if I put color down, it's going to move quite a lot. So I'm going to start up in this upper right corner, where there's more blue and less white. So what I'm doing is looking at the blue shapes, just looking at the blue shapes as shapes. And I'm also looking at sort of what happens, what patterns there are in this sky. So one pattern that happens in this sky is that there are some sort of streaks of clouds, lines of clouds, and then lines of blue in between them. So I'm going to try to capture that linear quality as I'm painting my wet into wet. Our goal is to capture the character of the sky. Because I'm working on saturated paper, I have plenty of time to do this without it suddenly being a lot drier than it was. But I am keeping an eye on that. If it starts to dry, and things are really not spreading very much at all, I might need to come back and complete my painting on a different pass. So I'm not trying to capture exactly every blue shape that I see. What I'm trying to do is create blue shapes that are of the same nature as the blue shapes that I'm seeing, so that I'll get the quality of this sky. I don't really need to, the wind keeps blowing, and even if you were standing there looking at this sky, things would keep changing. So I don't need to make it exactly what it was the moment the shutter clicked on my camera. I just need to make it that sort of sky, so I can sort of create my lines in between the clouds and then create some connections in the sky that breaks things up into individual clouds. As it's starting to dry, I can come back and restate some of these areas if I want them to be a little darker. I might or might not want that, but if I do want that, now is the time, because at this point things are drying a little bit, so maybe it won't move quite as far. The lighter blue that's already moved outward kind of suggests the light edges of the clouds. I know right now it looks a little bit disconnected, so give it a chance to move. At this point, I'm looking less at the photograph and more at what's already on the page and trying to see places where you might see a bit more of the sky in between these clouds and emphasize those instead of just trying to fix it up to look like the photo, not trying to say, oh, I made a mistake, this cloud should be over there. Because again, the wind keeps blowing, no one knows. I can also, if I feel like I need to get things moving a little bit more, I can use gravity, as always. Keep in mind that when you're working wet and wet, the effects continue to develop for a while. If things reach a point where you're thinking, I love that, I don't want it to move anymore, you can use a hairdryer to sort of stop the action at that point. In this case, I liked what was happening and I let this dry naturally, and this is what it looks like after it's dry. I thought you might be interested to see a comparison too of what would happen if I tried to do this same sort of a sky using the lifting techniques that we talked about in an earlier video. So the one on the right is my not very good attempt to do this by lifting. Even on saturated paper, things are just drying too quickly and the details are too small and I can't get the contrast that I want. So I much prefer the negative painting method for something like this sky. In a painting like this, I might like to use gravity to help me create that sense of flow on the right-hand side of the painting. So I'm going to show you another negative painting example where we're going to tilt the page so that the paint flows off the page in the same direction that the wind is blowing. I'm going to talk about that bright white highlight in a later video. For this example, I'm just going to look at this upper right corner. I'm working again on saturated paper and I am going to get it uniformly wet as usual. I have here my leftover blue wash from our earlier demonstrations and a mystery gray wash. I'm not sure what this is made of. I'm using up some gray that I had already mixed for some other demonstrations. But we're not talking about color here. We're talking mostly about technique. So the motion is this way, from lower left to upper right. So I'm going to tip the painting like this. And then the very first thing I want to do is squint a little bit and see that the only pure white left is right down here and then a few little spots up there. So the very first thing I'm going to do is take a wash brush and my mystery gray and tint all of the areas that I don't want to leave any white. All right, so now all of this has at least a bit of a gray, so even the white areas over here, which aren't really white, will not jump out too much, and I'll be left with my light over on this side and right through here. So now let's start laying in our blues. So let's start up here. And I'm doing much the same thing that we did in the previous example. I'm just trying to get the characteristic shapes here. I'm not trying to capture, not trying to capture the sky exactly. Just trying to get the idea. And because my page is tipped, I'm getting this motion that I don't even have to work to make happen. And I can use my brush to create a little of that motion too. One thing that happens when you're working wet into wet is if you touch the brush down, you immediately start to get a circular shape. So if you want these strokes to hold their shape, you don't want to put your brush down and move it and then lift it up and kind of stop right there. It's best to have the brush in motion when it contacts the page and when it leaves the page. So I'm stroking the brush over the page and letting it be in motion as it connects with the paper. Using a little bit of thirsty brush can work well with this type of a situation to create a little bit more wispiness in a few areas. But be careful because there's a temptation to just start fiddling and fiddling and fiddling and sort of fiddle it to death. So a little goes a long way. Don't get carried away. So here's where we are, and as I look at this, I see I was too timid in my first wash where I added that gray to knock back the lights. That's not uncommon. So I might let this dry and come back and add another layer to knock back the upper right corner and keep the light down in the lower left. But I think you get the idea of the negative painting technique, so I'm going to move on to the next negative painting technique where we're going to use a spray bottle to get some interesting sparkle. We could use the same method we used in the first example for this sky, but I find that when so little of the sky is white and the highlights are so bright, it's hard for me to keep things from just growing together and losing all my light. So this next example is a technique that sometimes gives you the feeling of that bright white highlight as we have in this sky. All right, once again, I'm working on saturated paper, but this technique is one that I would actually do on dry paper. So I'm only working on saturated paper so that I didn't have to stretch it. And to make it behave like dry paper, what I'm going to do is take some paper towels and just press firmly all over the surface. And remove all the surface moisture. And then I'll just save my paper towels and use these again. So as long as the surface of the paper is dry, the moisture inside the paper does not make the paint move. So I've removed as much as I can by blotting, and then I usually wait about a minute or two for any little droplets that I missed to get a chance to evaporate. So we're going to pause just a moment here and then we'll come back and I'll show you that this actually behaves like dry paper. So let's just take a little of our gray, and over in the corner you can see that that brushstroke looks like a brushstroke made on dry paper. Now I'm going to take a spray bottle that will produce droplets in addition to a mist. What I want to be able to do is get drops like this. So I'm squeezing just a little bit. So I'm going to take my paper and I'm going to basically sprinkle droplets all over the page. Some are bigger, some are smaller. That's great. That's what I want to have happen. So now I'm laying in my shapes using a similar method to our first method, but because the paper is mostly dry, the paint can't move as much. But because it's spritzed, it can move some. There are some hard edges here, but because of the spritz, those are broken up by places where the paint moves too, and it helps give me the sense of a little bit of softness in the sky instead of just painting this all with hard-edged shapes. And then I can use this in conjunction with the gravity method if I want, and just kind of move things around and help coax some of this sort of thing to happen. So this is what we wind up with. In the photograph, you can see a little better than on the video how the paint crawls in where those little droplets help connect the drier areas, and you get that softening effect and also kind of a sparkle along the edges of the clouds. And I think this is great for backlit clouds. So there are 3 methods that you can use for painting clouds by negative painting. In the next video, we'll talk about how to preserve small, bright white, soft-edged highlights using a special kind of resist.